No one expects to see a Hollywood star in an ordinary park, especially in old, faded clothes that don't attract attention. But when Patrol Officer Grayson spots a man who looks out of place, he jumps to conclusions. He sees a man in worn-out jeans and a hoodie, calmly feeding pigeons. An ordinary homeless person? Or perhaps someone who arouses suspicion? Grayson doesn't think twice about it and decides to clean up the mess. But the officer has no idea that he has just picked the wrong person. Because this man is Keanu Reeves, an action star, a man who not only has acting skills, but has also been training in martial arts for years. And when the officer crosses the line, he learns a lesson he will remember forever. The park was alive with movement and sound, a quiet symphony of city life unfolding under the warm afternoon sun. The trees swayed gently with the breeze, their leaves whispering in hushed tones above the meandering pathways where people strolled leisurely. Joggers passed by in rhythmic strides, the occasional laughter of children echoing from the nearby playground. Birds flitted between the branches, their songs blending into the distant hum of traffic just beyond the park's boundary. Keanu Reeves sat alone on an old wooden bench near the center of it all, his posture relaxed but upright. He wore a simple hoodie, its sleeves pushed up slightly, revealing forearms lightly marked by time and effort. His jeans were faded, comfortable, the fabric worn in a way that suggested long familiarity rather than neglect. Sneakers rested lightly on the pavement, the scuffed soles an unspoken testament to a life spent moving. A small bag of birdseed sat beside him, crinkled at the edges. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into it, retrieving a handful of seeds and scattering them onto the ground at his feet. A cluster of pigeons, already accustomed to his presence, fluttered closer, pecking eagerly at the offerings. He watched them with quiet amusement, his dark eyes reflecting the soft golden hues of the setting sun. It was a simple act, one devoid of urgency or expectation. Few people noticed him. Those who did gave him only passing glances, their gazes sliding away, as if instinctively dismissing him as just another figure blending into the backdrop of daily life. And that was exactly how he preferred it. No flashing cameras, no expectant fans. Just the quiet, the birds, the world moving around him without interference. But not everyone was content to let the scene remain undisturbed. Officer Grayson had been patrolling the park for years. He walked the same routes daily, observed the same people, recognized the patterns of their movements. He saw the dog walkers, the elderly couples who fed ducks by the pond, the teenagers who loitered near the bike racks. He categorized them in his mind, creating a silent order that made sense to him. And then there were the ones who didn't fit. He spotted the man on the bench from a distance. Something about him didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way he was dressed, too casual, too unassuming. Maybe it was how he sat too still, too composed. Or maybe it was just the fact that Grayson didn't recognize him. And in his mind, unfamiliarity meant potential trouble. Adjusting his belt, the officer altered his path, his boots making deliberate contact with the pavement. His presence was always an announcement, his movements designed to draw attention, to make people aware of him before he ever spoke. A necessary display of control. Keanu remained still, his gaze unfocused as he watched the birds continue their frantic pecking at the scattered seed. The moment stretched, the world folding into itself, narrowing until it was just the bench, the pigeons, and the slow approach of an authority figure convinced of his own rightness. Grayson came to a stop just a few feet away. He let the silence linger, standing tall, his posture rigid. The sound of the city faded, the murmuring crowd reduced to a dull hum in the background. The pigeons, sensing the shift in energy, hesitated, a few of them flapping away in startled bursts. A flicker of something passed across Keanu's face. Not concern, not annoyance. Just awareness. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the heavy expectation of compliance embedded in his stance. Slowly, he turned his head, finally meeting the eyes watching him. Grayson's stare was direct, assessing. He was the kind of man who had spent years perfecting a look that suggested unquestionable authority. It worked on most people. It was designed to. But Keanu was not most people. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The weight of the city pressed in around them, stretching the silence between two men who had no reason to know each other. And yet, here they were. The officer's hand rested near his belt, a subtle placement, but intentional. His body language spoke volumes, projecting a command that had yet to be vocalized. Keanu remained still, his presence unchanged. He had spent years mastering control, not just of his body, but of his reactions, his expressions, the energy he allowed into the spaces he occupied. He understood people, the way they moved, the intentions behind their choices. And this officer? He had already decided who he was dealing with. A lone pigeon dared to step forward again, pecking cautiously at the last few seeds strewn across the pavement. The moment stretched longer, the unseen tension coiling tighter, waiting for a shift, an action, a choice. Grayson's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his composed exterior. He was waiting for something, acknowledgement, submission, a sign that his presence had been registered as an obstacle to be obeyed. But Keanu offered nothing. No challenge, no retreat, just stillness. The world around them moved on. Joggers passed, unaware. Children's laughter rang out from the playground. The city pulsed, unconcerned with the quiet battle of wills unfolding in the park. But for these two men, in this single moment, everything had come to a halt. And somewhere, unseen but inevitable, the next step was already forming. The tension in the air remained unspoken but palpable. Keanu could feel the officer's presence looming over him, waiting for some kind of response, a shift in posture, an indication that authority had been acknowledged. But Keanu had spent years training himself to remain still under pressure, to observe rather than react. The officer's stance was too rigid, too controlled, betraying his expectation that the encounter would follow a predictable pattern. Compliance or defiance. Those were usually the only options. But Keanu did neither. The pigeons had mostly scattered by now, save for a few lingering ones that hesitated near his feet. He reached into the crinkled bag of birdseed again, taking his time as he scattered another handful onto the ground. His movements were slow, deliberate. He was in no rush. The act, mundane as it was, carried with it an implicit message. He was not affected by the officer's presence. Grayson's jaw clenched slightly, though he tried to mask it. His entire career had been built on control, controlling situations, controlling people. This man, sitting before him, had become an anomaly, something outside of the structure he had learned to enforce. Most people, when confronted by uniformed authority, offered some sign of submission. A flicker of nervousness, a shift in posture, a hurried explanation. But this man was unervingly calm. The longer the silence stretched, the more the surrounding world seemed to narrow, as if the normal ebb and flow of the park had dimmed in importance. The background noise, the chatter of passers-by, the occasional bark of a dog became nothing more than static. The real focus was here between them. Grayson exhaled slowly through his nose. He wasn't used to this feeling, this sense of standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite define. He prided himself on being able to read people, to know what they were about, and how they would react before they even spoke. Yet here he was standing over a man who gave him nothing. He adjusted his belt slightly, an unnecessary motion, but one meant to reassert his presence. His fingers brushed against the cool leather of his holster, a reminder of the authority he carried. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble, in his experience, often came in quiet forms before it escalated. Keanu finally glanced up again, his expression unreadable. Not challenging, not submissive, just there, watching. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no trace of aggression, just patience. The moment stretched a little longer. Then, finally, the officer spoke. "You got a reason to be sitting here all day?" The words came out controlled, measured. A carefully constructed question meant to probe, to nudge the situation toward an expected outcome. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He let the words settle, as if considering whether they even warranted a response. Then, just as slowly, he reached into the bag of birdseed again, tossing another handful onto the ground. Just feeding the birds. Simple. Direct. devoid of explanation beyond what was necessary. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't the answer he wanted. It wasn't even the words themselves. It was the way they were said. No urgency, no concern, just a statement, flat and immovable. The officer shifted his weight, subtly adjusting his stance. He wasn't entirely sure what reaction he had expected, but it wasn't this. A movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A jogger, slowing slightly, casting a quick glance their way before continuing down the path. Not unusual, but enough to remind him that they weren't alone. The encounter, while small, had already begun to draw attention. He needed to bring it to a conclusion. But Keanu made no move to leave. There was no direct challenge in his body language, but there was an absence of deference. That, in itself, was enough to keep the tension between them crackling just beneath the surface. Grayson took another step forward. The motion was casual, but not without intent. It put him just slightly inside Keanu's personal space, a calculated maneuver designed to elicit some kind of reaction. Most people, when confronted with an encroachment like this, would instinctively shift, even if just slightly. It was a subconscious acknowledgement of the presence of power. Keanu didn't move. Instead, he remained exactly as he was, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady. His eyes, however, were sharp, quietly noting the officer's actions. Grayson felt something tighten in his chest. There was an unmistakable energy in this man, something controlled and deeply rooted, something that hinted at a level of awareness he wasn't used to encountering in civilians. It made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite explain why. The officer's fingers flexed briefly before settling at his side again. The moment needed to shift. He needed to regain control of the interaction, to set the terms before the strange balance of power tipped further in the wrong direction. "I'm going to have to ask you to move along," Grayson said, his voice firmer now. Less of a suggestion, more of an expectation. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, then reached for another handful of birdseed. "I'm not bothering anyone." That was it. That was all he said. And it was enough. Grayson's pulse ticked up slightly. His control over the situation, fragile as it was, felt as though it was slipping further through his fingers. The problem wasn't that the man was resisting. The problem was that he wasn't engaging the way he was supposed to. There was no refusal, no provocation, just stillness, an impenetrable wall of presence that Grayson didn't know how to push past. A flicker of frustration passed through him, but he forced it down. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. The golden light stretched out behind Keanu, making his silhouette seem larger than it should have been. Another jogger slowed as she passed, her gaze flickering toward them. The moment had begun to expand beyond them, taking shape in the awareness of others. Grayson knew he had a choice to make, and he hated the fact that, for the first time in years, he didn't know what the right one was. The silence between them deepened, stretching like an invisible tether holding them in place. The world beyond their standoff continued unaffected. The rustling trees, the distant murmur of conversation, the rhythmic pounding of runners' feet against the pavement. But here, in this small pocket of tension, everything else felt secondary. Grayson felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when a situation was slipping out of his hands, and something about this man, this quiet, unshaken figure, was eroding the authority he had spent years cultivating. He had expected compliance, or at least resistance he could handle. But instead, he got stillness, patience, something unervingly unreadable. The officer straightened his posture, adjusting his belt in another unnecessary motion. A performance for himself, if nothing else. He had been trained to take control, to ensure that uncertainty never found a home in his actions. But there was no script for this. The man in front of him was not reacting as he should. Keanu remained seated, his gaze steady but unthreatening. He had not moved except to scatter another handful of seeds for the pigeons, a gesture so casual that it only made Grayson's discomfort grow. The officer clenched his jaw. He needed to make a choice between escalation and retreat. He had always prided himself on knowing when to press forward and when to back off. But this was new territory. His instincts were warring with his training, telling him that forcing the issue would not go the way he wanted it to. Nearby, a man walking his dog slowed as he passed, his gaze flickering between them. A woman on a nearby bench watched with subtle curiosity. It was enough to remind Grayson that his actions were not happening in a vacuum. The moment was growing, spreading, taking root in the minds of those observing. A flicker of frustration passed through him. He could feel it, simmering beneath the surface, clawing at his composure. This should have been a simple interaction. He was the authority here. He was the one who dictated the outcome. But then Keanu moved. Not a sudden motion, not a challenge. Just a shift, a slight adjustment in his posture, as though settling deeper into the bench. His hands remained in sight, open, unthreatening. But the movement was enough. A warning, or perhaps a statement. Grayson exhaled slowly through his nose, weighing his options. He could press the issue, demand that the man stand, try to force compliance. Or he could walk away, let it go, acknowledge that this was not a battle worth fighting. The latter choice grated against his pride. But he wasn't a fool. He had seen enough in his years on the force to recognize when a situation had shifted beyond his control. With a slow, deliberate motion, Grayson took a step back. It wasn't submission. It wasn't defeat. It was simply acknowledgement. Keanu met his gaze once more, something quiet and knowing in his expression. There was no smugness, no victory, just understanding. Grayson gave him one last look, then turned on his heel, walking away without another word. The tension lingered in the space between them, even as the officer disappeared down the path. Keanu remained seated, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He knew this wasn't the end. He had been in enough fights, both physical and unspoken, to recognize that this was merely an interlude. The pigeons returned, pecking at the remaining seeds scattered at his feet. And as the world around him carried on, he let out a slow breath, watching the sun dip lower behind the trees. The air in the park remained heavy even after Officer Grayson walked away. Though the immediate tension had dispersed, something unspoken lingered, unseen but undeniably present. Keanu remained seated, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, his presence unmoving. The pigeons at his feet pecked at the last of the scattered birdseed, unfazed by the human confrontation that had unfolded before them. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the pathways. The park, despite the brief disturbance, continued in its rhythm. Families strolled, joggers passed by, and casual visitors enjoyed the crisp air. And yet, beneath this surface of normalcy, the echoes of what had happened remained, lingering in the minds of those who had witnessed the encounter. A pair of teenagers on bikes whispered to each other as they looked toward Keanu, their curiosity piqued by what they had seen. A woman with a golden retriever hesitated slightly as she passed, as if debating whether to speak, but ultimately moved on. People were watching. Not obviously, not directly, but they were aware. And Keanu knew it. He could feel it. The experience was nothing new to him. He had lived long enough, seen enough, to recognize the quiet aftermath of moments like these. He was not unfamiliar with power struggles, whether in the controlled setting of a film set, in business negotiations, or in life itself. This was different, yet the same. It was the weight of perception, of expectation, of the unseen mechanisms that governed human interactions. He sat with it, allowing it to settle rather than resisting it. There was no use in dwelling on what had happened. The officer had made his choice. He had walked away. But Keanu also knew that men like Grayson did not forget moments like these so easily. The balance of power had shifted, if only slightly, and that would linger far longer than any words exchanged. As the evening continued to stretch its fingers across the sky, the distant hum of the city beyond the park became more prominent. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, unrelated yet ever-present, a reminder of the world outside this small sanctuary of trees and walkways. The urban pulse of life carried on. Minutes passed, then an hour. The flow of the park changed, the daytime visitors thinning, replaced by those who thrived in the later hours. The runners who preferred the cool air, the couples finding quiet corners, the loners seeking solace in the dim glow of streetlights. Keanu stood finally, his movements smooth, unhurried. He reached into his bag, folding up the now empty packet of birdseed, tucking it away as he prepared to leave. The moment was over. Whatever came next, he would meet it as it arrived. He had long learned that life unfolded in its own way, often in ways unseen until much later. As he walked toward the exit of the park, he felt the eyes on him once more. A few of those who had been present for the earlier confrontation still lingered, perhaps waiting for something more to unfold. But Keanu gave them nothing. He walked as he always did, steady, composed, without urgency. The city awaited beyond the park's edge, and with it, whatever came next. The evening deepened as Keanu moved through the park's winding pathways, the last of the golden sunlight giving way to the cool blue of twilight. Streetlights flickered to life, casting pools of pale yellow across the pavement, their glow stretching shadows long and distorted. The hum of the city beyond grew more pronounced, merging with the distant honk of traffic and the murmur of voices from nearby establishments. The atmosphere had shifted, no longer the lively energy of the afternoon, but something quieter, more reflective. The few remaining people in the park carried themselves differently. Heads bowed, hands tucked into pockets, their movements more solitary. It was a different world at this hour, one where conversations were murmurs and footsteps felt more purposeful. Keanu walked with the same steady pace, neither rushed nor hesitant. He had always found solace in spaces like these, where the city's weight faded just enough to let a person breathe. But tonight, the remnants of his earlier encounter still clung to the edges of his thoughts, not in a way that troubled him, but in a way that made him aware. Grayson was gone, for now, but the officer had left behind an energy that was hard to shake. The way he had stood, the way he had searched for control in a situation where it did not belong. The silence he had finally chosen. That silence had said more than words could. It was unfinished business, but Keanu wasn't one to chase endings. He turned a corner, heading toward the park's northern exit where the city streets opened up again. A few figures loitered by the benches near the entrance, talking in hushed voices. One of them flicked a cigarette into the dirt, crushing the ember beneath a worn-out sneaker. They were not a threat, not an obstacle, just people living their own rhythms, much like he was. Still, their eyes tracked him for a moment, measuring, assessing. Keanu was used to that. He had spent enough years moving through spaces unseen to know when he was being noticed. It didn't change anything. He walked past them with the same quiet confidence, his focus already moving ahead. A block down from the park's exit, the city was alive again. Neon signs blinked in methodical patterns, advertising late-night diners and corner stores. The scent of grilled food wafted through the air from an open-front restaurant, mingling with the sharper tang of vehicle exhaust. The streets were not crowded, but they weren't empty either, a balance between motion and stillness that the city always seemed to maintain. Keanu reached into his pocket, feeling the folded birdseed bag still tucked there, a small remnant of the day's simplicity. He considered discarding it, but chose not to. Some things, no matter how small, carried weight beyond their size. He moved along the sidewalk, blending seamlessly into the fabric of the city once more. Whatever awaited him next, he would meet it with the same steady resolve.